clear leadership model is particularly appropriate for leaders who are trying to build highly collaborative work systems. And what I call it is creating a climate of clarity. How do we create a climate where people are willing to tell each other the truth of their experience so that they don't get into the mush, where they're able to keep sustaining their partnership continuously? And, it's not about being nice, and it's not about not being in charge. I think in a climate of clarity, it's clear who's in charge around what. And people are clear about that, and they're able to describe their experience of that. And a big part of that has to do with the leader's ability to allow people to have their own experience and not get anxious if somebody's having a different experience from them. So some of the most important work has been working with executives around the clear leadership model, helping them understand how they show up in a way that says to others, look, this is what I'm about, this is what I care, this is where we're going, but I want to know how that lands on you. I want to hear about what makes it difficult or easy for you to buy in to my vision or to my process. Doesn't mean I'm going to change it, but I want to hear it. And on the basis of that, I might change it or I might not. Right? And so one of the things that's going on there is that what I call a differentiated leader, and that's part of what we learn in this course, is what does it mean to be a self-differentiated leader? Is a leader who's able to describe how he or she is going to use his or her authority in a way that makes it clear to others, and it's clear where they stand in that. And so I had one leader who was trying to change his organization. He wanted to create a whole new line of business. Now, this organization had been very successful for about 10 years on a particular line of business, and he wanted to move it in a different direction. And most of the executive team sort of agreed that that was the right thing to do, but there was a lot of uncertainty about what this meant for the old line of business, how things would be impacted, and so on. But when people tried to surface this with him, he would become aware of his own agitation, and it would just annoy him that people were asking questions, and he experienced it that they were resisting him or resisting change in some way. Now, what he wasn't as aware of was that he felt personally responsible for taking away their anxiety. And because he felt that way, then what he would do is when it surfaced, he would try to close it down, and he became more and more distant. He became more distant from his executive team, he became more distant from the rest of the organization, and in his mind, the need for this new strategy was obvious. Everybody was on board. People who had questions or were anxious, they would figure out once it was implemented that this was really in everybody's best interest and everything would be fine. What he didn't recognize was that because of his lack of communication, people were increasingly having to make up a story about what was going on with him and what was going on with the change, and they weren't pretty stories. And it got to the point where some of his best people were, fixing up their resumes and looking for another job, convinced that they were about to get fired because he wasn't returning their calls and such. And he had to come to grips with the fact that his connection to people and how much he cared about them and how difficult it was for him to actually confront their fears and concerns was creating a bigger problem than the change. And he had to learn about that, everybody's going to have a different experience. It's not his job to change other people's experience. And that is not a leader's job. Everybody creates their own experience, and so there are going to be multiple experiences. And we don't need to all have the same experience to work together well. In fact, we work together better when we allow the diversity of experiences voice in an organization or in a group. And so one of the things I've noticed happens with executive groups that go through clear leadership, and I think this happens to other groups as well, but it's particularly noticeable with executive groups because one of the dynamics that goes on in executive teams, I find, is that they tend to be afraid of raising their concerns about each other's area of influence because, well, that's his job. I'm not going to talk about it. He's going to feel challenged. Why should I bring that up? It'll just slow down the meeting, so on and so on and so on. And because of that mindset, these groups become more and more distant from each other. And one of the things that clear leadership allows them to do is to say, I can talk about what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling, what I'm wanting that's different from you without it being a challenge. just the fact that I'm having a different experience is not challenging. Of course I'm having a different experience. So it gives us permission to just talk about what's really in the room. And when we talk about what's really in the room, then people aren't out in the hallway talking about stuff, they're talking about it in the room. And this is another thing I've noticed, is that when people have meetings, they talk about some things, but the hard stuff doesn't get talked about in the meeting. It's talked about out in the hallway in small groups where people talk about what they really think. But in order for good decisions to get made and agreements to get made that people are actually going to follow through on, those hard conversations need to happen in the room. And that's what the clear leadership model does, is it gives people the permission to have those hard conversations. So in the research we've done following up what happens to people after they go through the clear leadership course and what happens in organizations, the number one thing that we found is that it changes how people have meetings. And the meetings now, people come out of meetings clear about what was agreed on, what wasn't agreed on. And when things start to go sideways in the meeting, that's when they pull out their clear leadership skills to get clear about why are things going sideways here and get back on track so they can get back on the work. And to me, that's exactly the whole point. How do we learn in the midst of performing? Okay? We're working on stuff together, we're having conversations, we're trying to get from point A to point B, and all of a sudden it becomes a hairball. And it's at that moment when the clear leadership skills, if they can get pulled out and people can sort out what's going on here and figure it out and get back on track and get back towards whatever they're trying to accomplish, that's learning in the face of performing. And I just have so many examples of that now, that this is one of the consequences of the clear leadership course. So if you work in an organization that depends on people being in conversation to get the work done, I think this is an essential skill set, not just for leaders, but for everybody who's working together, so that they can have those kind of conversations. It's not about being open and honest. And there's a lot of talk these days about authenticity and open and honesty. I think there's a lot of things that are better left unsaid. But what it is about is transparency. Letting each other understand what's going on in each other's heads so that we don't have to make up a story, we can get clear about it. And most of the time when we get clear, we make sense to each other. Because everybody who's operating together, everybody's making sense to each other. Let me give you an example of that. Think of someone that you work with who you find difficult to work with. In some way they're a problem, you're constantly finding yourself annoyed, they're difficult to work with. Now think about that person for a second. Now, isn't it obvious to you how they are the problem? And if only they would change, they would talk differently or act differently or do something differently, the problem would go away. But I can tell you that if I went and talked to them, it would be clear to them how you are the problem. And if only you would change and you would do things differently, and so it would all go away, right? So there's something going on in that pattern of interaction, right, that needs to get cleared up. And when it gets cleared up, things change. Now, the biggest reason why people don't have those conversations, aside from not being very skillful at it, which we can teach those skills, but the reason people don't have those conversations is that they're convinced that their story about the other person is true. Oh, that other person is too controlling. What's the point of talking about it? They're controlling. Nothing. It won't change anything. Or that person really doesn't care. They're not motivated around this project. What's the point of talking about it? They're not motivated. It's not going to change anything. Or that person doesn't like me. They don't respect me. So what's the point of talking about that? So we don't talk about it. And we live in our story. And I've now just accumulated dozens and dozens of stories that have been related to me about people who've gone through the course and as a result of which gone and actually had those conversations and discovered that their story was completely inaccurate and have turned around those relationships and they're now effective and successful. And one of the most dramatic, and it was dramatic I think for a couple of reasons. One was this was a broken relationship that had existed for about 5 years, where these two senior managers were widely seen in the organization as incompatible, don't like each other, and not only that, but their two respective organizations that they were in charge of couldn't get along. And when people from those two organizations were in the same meeting, it was always a conflict and a mess, and the rest of the organization had in fact it was kind of had reorganized themselves so that they wouldn't have to actually deal with these conflicts. And this was in a very large healthcare system, and these two managers were respectively responsible for geriatric inpatient services and geriatric outpatient services. And so as the organization went through the usual need to rationalize services and find synergies, this looked like an obvious area where some savings could be found and some ways to provide service could be improved. But because of the personal animosity between the two leaders of those two different departments, nothing had been successful. And when they tried to bring people together from those two, and we're talking about units of hundreds and hundreds of employees, nothing productive was getting done. And this went on for years. And finally, the executive of the company thought, we got to get rid of these people. Something has to change here. And as it turns out, those two managers had independently taken the Clear Leadership course. And during a meeting, one of them turned to the other and said, I think we need to have a learning conversation. And the other one agreed, and so they went to a local Starbucks, and they started to unravel all the stories they'd made up about each other and the things that had happened in their relationship. And they discovered that all the problems in their relationship started 5 years previously when one of them had been invited to be a member of a new governmental inquiry into geriatric care. And she thought this would be a very powerful and resume-enhancing experience, and out of respect and caring for her colleague, suggested that her colleague get given this appointment on this governmental panel. When her colleague got asked to do this and heard about this, she wondered why this other person had recommended her, and the story she made up was this other person didn't want to do the work and was sloughing the work off onto her. So now that she had that story, that this is what was going on, then she reacted to that person in a certain way, which this other person experienced as, why are you treating me this way after I've just done this very generous and noble thing for you? And well, from that point on, things just got worse and worse and worse until they ended up in the situation they were in. So the story is, at the end of that conversation, as they had unraveled all of that and figured out what had taken place, they decided to clear the decks, start anew, discovered they shared many similar values, had a lot of similar ideas for how to improve services, and began working together to do that. Now, the reason I heard about the story was because within weeks of that conversation, the relationships between people in those two parts of the organizations transformed so much that everybody else in the organization saw it and couldn't believe it and wondered, how is this happening? What happened here? And started to investigate what happened. And then they found out that these leaders had had this conversation. Now, and as a result of that, those two units began working together beautifully, and they came up with a number of ideas for how to do things. Now, what's striking to me is that there weren't any interventions into that organization. There was no attempt to do conflict management between groups or to do any of that. Really, it started right at the top. And I think that's true of all organizations, that organizations mirror the pathologies of their leaders. And if leaders are in conflict, and if they're in the mush with each other, that condition, waterfalls down the rest of the organization. And when they clean their stuff up, the stuff starts to clean up all throughout the system. So I think what the Clear Leadership course teaches is a set of skills. There's 12 specific skills that are taught. And all of these skills contribute to being able to have what I call a learning conversation effectively. Each of the skills is useful on their own, but really the penultimate thing is this ability to have a learning conversation. And what happens in a learning conversation is I understand what your experience is, I understand what my experience is, and the difference between them. We get to interpersonal clarity. And 4 out of 5 times, the problems that are being created in the organization get cleared out. Now, we did another research study where we were looking at the impact of the course on managers, and we were interested in what the impact was on their attitudes around conflict. So one of my graduate students had an interest in this, and it was interesting because we don't actually use that word in the course or in the book. We don't focus on the idea of conflict, but his theory was that as a result of this course, managers would develop a different mindset about conflict. And so we tested that. And in North America, and perhaps many places of the world, the dominant managerial framework around conflict is based on a model that says, conflict, the way we resolve conflict is by understanding what your needs and interests and wants are, and understanding what my needs and interests and wants are, and finding ways in which we can both kind of get what we want. We call it win-win conflict resolution. The Harvard Negotiation Project, a book called Getting to Yes, has been widely influential in developing our ways of thinking about how we manage conflict. And our theory was that if once people came out of the course, they would shift from that way of thinking about conflict to thinking about conflict in a more narrative way. And what I mean by that is the idea that conflict is a story I make up to explain a difficult relationship to myself. And it's as though I have a story of conflict. And once I've decided that this is a conflicted relationship, then I play out my story. And that as a result of the course, I would come to see that the way I can manage a conflict is by restorying the relationship. That is, changing the story of the relationship. So we went and tested that assumption, thinking, well, we'd find some people who'd change and some people wouldn't. And we were stunned to discover that 100% of our sample had all shifted their image of what conflict was about. And all were, one way or another, thinking about conflict in more narrative ways. Not only that, but I'm forgetting the exact numbers now, but it was more than half had completely altered the way that they had handled conflicts at work and were now seeking out. And here's the other thing I think. Most middle managers avoid conflict. Why do middle managers avoid conflict? Because in the dominant interest-based position on conflict, I need to figure out what your interests and wants are, and then you need to figure out mine, and then we have to trade stuff. And as a middle, I don't experience myself as having any control over resources or my agenda. It's like I'm constantly stuck between a rock and a hard place. And so if I'm going to step into trying to negotiate a win-win solution with you, what will become painfully apparent is how little control I have over anything. I can't negotiate anything because I have no control over my agenda, over my resources, over, stuff's coming at me. So I avoid it. But if I come to the conclusion that actually conflict is about my story of you and that I can change my story in a moment, well, it becomes much more enticing to test that out and to go find out and to actually address the conflict. And that's what these managers were telling us. They were much more willing to go and confront conflict, that a lot of times, and that 4 out of 5 times, they were finding that that's what it was. They just needed to change their story and the conflict went away. Or they'd say things like, well, I discovered there really wasn't a conflict. I was just, my assumptions were incorrect. And the other thing that more than half us told us was that as a result of the course, they were coaching others in how to go manage conflicts differently from this sort of narrative perspective. So clearly, if you work in an organization where you rely on people to work together to get stuff done, there's going to be conflict. And the ability to manage differences productively is probably one of the key things that differentiates high-performing organizations from the usual run-of-the-road mediocre ones. And Clear Leadership provides both a model and a set of tools for being able to manage differences productively in a way that people aren't feeling like they're being asked to be different from who they are. In fact, instead, people are being asked to bring all of who they are to the interaction.